Handheld gaming has come a long way. From the early days of 8-bit graphics to full 3D open world experiences, it has grown exponentially in the past decades. One of the main desires that most gamers have was bringing the console experiences on the go. Nowadays, you can easily do this with devices like the Steam Deck, but for the longest time, finding a one-to-one console version to handheld experience was few and far between. Most console to portable ports were limited in scope, reduced in both gameplay and graphics, and a lot of times were almost two separate experiences. Thankfully, there are various examples of developers who went the extra mile to make your dream of your favorite console experience to work on a portable console. My name is Mako, and in today's video I'll be showcasing 6 examples of ambitious and impressive console to handheld ports. These ports range from being one-to-one examples to pushing the target hardware to its absolute limits. To kick things off, let's flick a switch. Let's start with the most recent example out of this list. Originally released in 2015, Dying Light is a first-person action survival game set in the fictional city of Haran. You play as Kyle Crane, an undercover operative sent in the quarantined city of Haran to recover an important file from a rogue political figure. One thing leads to another, and you're faced with situations bigger than expected. The open world is filled with a variety of infected, with a day and night cycle and a dash of parkour, making this a memorable experience. Dying Light is a fast-paced game where you spend most of your time running and climbing buildings. When it was first revealed, people were skeptical of this game running well on the Nintendo Switch. Considering the fact that there was originally planned an Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 version of this game, which was cancelled midway through development due to the hardware limitations, people were very skeptical that the Nintendo Switch could even run this game at all. Somehow, Techland and the team who ported this game pulled it off very well. This game runs at a consistent 30 FPS cap with little to no screen tearing or any sort of screen artifacts. Even when you get into fighting massive amounts of hordes or even running throughout the environment, the performance of this game remains very solid. Visually, it is also quite impressive. Everything from the shadows, the lighting in the open world just seems very appealing on the Nintendo Switch. The full experience to the Switch is carried over as well, including all the DLC from the base game, as well as additional mod maps from the PC version. This version also includes a 4-player drop-in, drop-out cooperative multiplayer fully intact, making this a near, if not perfect, one-to-one version to its PC counterpart. This is an exceptional port that showcases the power of the Nintendo Switch when it's developed in the right hands. Now don't get me wrong, we have other examples like the Witcher 3 port and Doom Eternal, which are all very impressive and well deserving on this list, but I personally found the Dying Light port to be one of the more unique examples. Regardless, Dying Light on the Nintendo Switch is still one of the best ways to enjoy this game even in 2023, and it's well worth your hard-earned money. One of the more ambitious ports on this list come from a long but not forgotten platform, the PlayStation Vita and its Borderlands 2 port. Borderlands 2 is a first-person looter shooter RPG created by Gearbox Software. Originally released in 2012, it's most known for its thousands of guns to loot and its open-level design. Borderlands 2 pits you in one of the 4 playable Vault Hunters. After being trapped by the main antagonist, Handsome Jack, the game pits you in exploring the world of Pandora while you search for Handsome Jack. You spend a lot of your time in this game looting weapons, leveling up your Vault Hunter, and hunting various enemies. A game like this in a portable setting seems like a perfect match. However, the PlayStation Vita version wasn't exactly the case. The performance in this port, to say it lightly, is pretty rough. Most of the time, the game hangs around the 15 FPS mark, dropping to single digits in more intense scenes. Due to this, the co-op experience, which this game is known for, went from 4 players to 2 players only on the Vita version, making it more challenging and less accessible versus the console counterpart. Visually, this game has been downscaled in order to work on the PlayStation Vita. This is to be expected considering the Vita's hardware limitations, and actually doesn't look that bad at all, especially on the Vita's OLED display. So if this port is rough, then why is it on this list? Because despite all the shortcomings this port has, it's still a very impressive feat. The fact that this game not only runs, is playable from start to finish, and includes all the downloadable content from the base game is a feat on its own. You can tell the developers tried their hardest to make this experience work on the PlayStation Vita, and they got very close to it. I think the ambition and dream here was to bring Borderlands 2 on the Vita, and for the most part, it's like it's almost 80% there. The team that was in charge of this port was actually done by Iron Galaxy, best known today for their Last of Us Part 1 PC port and the Arkham Knight PC port, which really doesn't need any explanation on its own. Borderlands 2 on the PlayStation Vita is an ambitious port and deserves a spotlight for what it was able to achieve on the hardware given to it. What handheld list wouldn't be complete without mentioning the PlayStation Portable and its very ambitious Star Wars Battlefront 2 port. Star Wars Battlefront 2 was originally released by Pandemic Studios in 2005, with the PSP port being handled by Salvage Entertainment. If you don't know who they are, they're now a defunct studio who made various ports throughout the 2000s on a host of platforms. They're also known for making the cancelled Saints Row Undercover game on the PlayStation Portable. Battlefront 2 puts players in the shoes of either the Galactic Republic or the Empire. Set in various worlds within the Star Wars universe, the game offered a campaign mode, but was most known for its excellent conquest mode. Released as a launch style for the PSP, Battlefront 2 was a PlayStation 2 port converted over to the PSP. At the time of the release, most console ports looked like this, or even a 2D rendition of the console experience, which made this port even more special. For a PSP game, it actually runs well, all things considered. There is your typical frame stutter and a lot of drops in frames here and there, but that's to be expected due to the limited hardware. The scope and scale in the PlayStation 2 version was almost entirely ported over, with some exceptions. Graphically, the game looks much more reduced and less detailed versus its console counterparts. The PlayStation Portable version also runs a lower native resolution to a whopping 480 by 272 pixels, which as a result made it look like a PlayStation 1 port of Battlefront 2. The controls are also kind of funky in this one. Since there's not extra thumbsticks on the PSP, you have to use either the X, square, circle, or triangle to aim. It sounds kind of weird in practice, but honestly, over time it never really bothered me. It's a little funky at first and it's pretty overbearing, especially if you're using an emulator, but not for nothing, it worked and it wasn't game breaking by any means. Additional missing features on the PlayStation Portable port include no online features, only local multiplayer using ad hoc mode, missing DLC, and some maps were altered to fit the PSP's limitations. Aside from the key differences, the experience remained the same, which was wild in 2005. Being able to bring Battlefront 2 wherever you go was a different experience on its own and mind-boggling for its time. It even included the first-person mode too. That being said, the same month, there was another impressive port that was released from a franchise you wouldn't expect to work on a handheld, Splinter Cell. Splinter Cell Chaos Theory on the DS is a perfect example of an ambitious DS port. The game's plot revolves around Sam Fisher being sent to Peru to rescue a programmer who was kidnapped and had knowledge on a super weapon. The programmer is then killed and you follow Sam Fisher go throughout the world in order to stop the super weapon from being used. The game originally released on March 21st, 2005 on the DS by Ubisoft Montreal. Unlike most console to handheld DS ports, which were generally done in 2D, Chaos Theory was fully 3D, making it stand out among the crowd. Although it's not a one-to-one version of the console port, this version of the game is very impressive considering the hardware limitations of the Nintendo DS. This game offered features you come to expect from a Splinter Cell game, including stealth, third-person combat, and even takedowns. However, not everything in this port is all great. The performance in this port is very rough. This game hovers around frame rates that would make a PowerPoint presentation blush. Textures and details also look very downgraded versus the console version and makes it harder to play thanks to this caveat. Despite all this, Splinter Cell on the DS is an ambitious and quite an oddball port to the console. This certainly isn't the best way to play this game by any stretch, but it is an example of an early game on the DS library that pushed the system to its absolute limits. They eventually remade this game on the 3DS, which is a lot better way to play Chaos Theory on the go. Weirdly enough, the Nokia N-Gage actually got a port of Chaos Theory as well. While we're on the topic of the N-Gage, Tomb Raider on the N-Gage. Released in 2003 on the forgotten Nokia N-Gage, Tomb Raider was a port of the PS1 game, originally released in 1996 by Core Design. The game revolves around Lara Croft, an adventurer who's searching for the artifact called the Scion of Atlantis. It plays like a third-person action-adventure game, with you climbing and shooting various enemies throughout the experience. Considering the N-Gage released 1 year prior to the DS and 2 years before the PSP, to say this port was ahead of its time is an understatement. To give you an idea, portable gaming in 2003 was either on the Game Boy Advance, that piece of shit Tiger Electronics Game.com thing, or even the Game Boy Color. The performance of this port was solid all things considered, held a consistent frame rate, nothing groundbreaking, but for those who actually played the port, the general consensus is that it was playable to say at least. Visually, on the other hand, it looks like if the PlayStation 1 version was deep-fried in comparison. It still retains the shadows, the lighting, and reflections that all add to the art style and tone to this port. I will say the controls, on the other hand, left a lot to be desired. First off, Playing any games on Nokia N-Gage was the equivalent of taking a shit while doing a handstand. But honestly, what else could you ask for in 2003? This not only showcased that the N-Gage could do 3D and 3D well for its time, but was also a glimpse in the future of the direction that handheld gaming was going into. I think this port is an important piece of forgotten media that deserves more recognition for what it was able to achieve in its time frame. However, the most ambitious and only unreleased port on this list goes to Quake on the Game Boy Advance. Quake is a first-person shooter released by id Software in 1996, a game that was more focused on its gameplay and music than its story. Quake takes the player through various dungeon-style environments with a nice array of guns to choose from. This port was originally created by Randy Linden. Randy's previous work was on the SNES port of Doom and the impressive PlayStation 1 emulator called Bleem. At the time, porting a game like Quake to the GBA seemed as impossible, as the hardware was just too limited to run full 3D graphics. Hell, even Nintendo themselves marketed the GBA as only running two-dimensional games. This didn't stop Randy from achieving the impossible. To give you an idea, when Quake was released in 1996, it was a very demanding game for PCs at the time. Although this wasn't the full game, nor was this port ever released, this port of Quake is a massive technical feat. Simply put, the GBA has no intentions of scaling 3D games to its hardware. The story goes that Linden actually made this prototype in order to show id Software once it was completed to be released on the Game Boy Advance. This never became a reality, however. By the time it was presented to id, the Game Boy Advance started to fade in popularity, and with the upcoming DS on the horizon, it made no sense to release this on the GBA at the time. Parts of the code of this port was eventually used in another game called Cyborg, which was released on Android and even demoed on an iPod video at one point. That's really cool. If you want to learn more about the story and the history of this port, I recommend watching MVG's video covering this incredible feat. That was 6 ambitious console to handheld ports. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you know of any other ones, please let me know in the comments down below. If you enjoy this style of content, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. Until next time guys, peace.